Today, many people question if the Bible accurately portrays what Jesus really said and did. Some people claim it was written so long ago it can't possibly be correct, or that it was written so long after Jesus died that there must have been corruptions in between. But what we can show is that through the Jewish culture at the time, what Jesus said and did is actually able to be preserved accurately until the Gospels were written. And the Gospels were actually written fairly close to the time that Jesus died. Now, today when we look at the Gospels, we look at the text itself and analyze manuscripts to understand if it was really what Jesus said and did. We want to know this because we have a reason, and we don't want to believe something that there's no truth for behind it. There's no rational, good reasons to believe something. The men of Jesus' time had this same desire. They didn't want to believe something that wasn't true. So they too would have looked at what they had received and to see if it was reasonable to believe it. Now, what they received it orally. Now, they received it orally for about 30 years. And even after the Gospels were written, this oral culture still continued. We see several examples of that. One is the example of Papias, who had received whenever he met a Christian, he would ask them, tell me what the Apostle Matthew said. Tell me what the Apostle Thomas said. Tell me what John said. Tell me what James said. He wanted to know these stories, and he trusted them. He even said he trusted them more than a written account. This is quite remarkable to us. We would assume the exact opposite. This has to do a lot with our culture today. Because for us, just even think back when you were a child, how many phone numbers you remembered. And think about how many phone numbers you can actually recall. Your own, maybe? Can you remember your parents'? And that's just because now we have this technology where it records all of our phone numbers for us, so we no longer have to do that. The same goes for all the books and newspapers and computers. We have everything written down for us. We don't have to remember much at all. But these ancient cultures, especially the Jewish culture, they had to remember everything. They didn't have this written word, at least in a common aspect like we do. Someone going to the marketplace had to remember everything they needed to buy, and especially really important things like the law. They trained men to remember the law because it was so important to them. And they gave them certain techniques to help remember the law and remember important things, such as the repetition of set phrases and parallelisms. And these things are actually seen in the Gospels. So we can see that the Gospels were remembered according to this pattern. So we can trust that it's reasonable to trust what was passed down from those who saw Jesus and lived with him. They would want to remember it. It was very important for them to remember it and pass it down to his followers. They would faithfully tell these stories back and forth to each other, and they'd be there to correct each other if anyone had forgotten anything or was corrupting anything. It's also assumed that because sometimes you hear the Gospels were written well after the fact of Jesus' death, and they're so far removed that everything had been forgotten. We can actually show, based on the secular history and the Gospel accounts themselves, that they were written probably within 30 years of Jesus' lifetime. This is a reasonable amount of time to remember something. Now, we can see this in each of the three, what we call the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You see that in Matthew, based on the reporting of Irenaeus, he said that while Peter and Paul were in Rome, Matthew was writing his Gospel. We know that Peter and Paul died in Rome around the year 65 AD. And we also know that it was written in Hebrew, which for the first time, according to the evidence of Jerome and others. Now, this being written in Hebrew gives it a very early date because the early evangelization was to the Jewish Hebrews and not to the Greek Gentiles. We also see this in the Gospel of Mark. It must have been written probably between the years 50 and 67 AD. This is, again, Papias records that he encountered John the Apostle, and John told him that Peter gave the account of the Gospel of Mark to Mark. Mark was Peter's secretary. And this is actually seen in the Gospel itself. There's different internal evidence that Peter was accounting these stories to Mark. And we know that Peter, again, died in Rome in the 60s AD. So we know Mark must have been written before that. The same goes for Luke. We can look at the evidence of Luke, and again, the deaths of Peter and Paul give us a clue to when Luke must have been written. We know that Luke was also the author of the Acts of the Apostles. The Acts of the Apostles is an account of especially Peter and Paul's lives and the way they lived. And this gives us the account of Peter and Paul, but it doesn't give the account of their death. And the death was something very important to Christians, especially this martyrdom. Something so important as the death that's not included in an account. It's reasonable to assume that account was written before their death. So we know the Acts of the Apostles must have been written before the death of Peter and Paul in the mid-60s. And we know the Gospel of Luke was written even before his account of the Acts. So the Gospel of Luke was probably written around the year 60 AD or earlier. So all three of these Gospels we can show reasonably were written within 30 years of the life of Jesus. And through the oral culture of the Jews at the time, it was reasonable that they could remember and faithfully pass on what they had seen Jesus do and what he had said throughout those times until they were written down. Now this is important for our faith, because we want our faith to be based on good, reasonable evidence. We don't want to assume or believe something that there's no good evidence for. And now we can see that this evidence is there, and it gives us, we can enter reading the Gospels with more trust and love. And if someone brings up these criticisms that the Gospels can't possibly be accurate, we know there's good solid reasons to explain that they are accurate.